They said she returned to him in silk and silence, that her eyes shone through another's face. That grief, if steeped long enough in madness, could carve the dead into the living. And so the boy stood there, trembling beneath a bridal veil. Rome cheered. Not for him, not even for love, but for the spectacle of it all. The blood that dried at his thighs was not from war. It was not from birth. It was from a knife. Cruel, ceremonial correction. His name was Sporus, though the name meant nothing now. Names are for people. He had become a relic stitched together by an emperor's sorrow, shaped into the outline of a memory. Nero called it love. History calls it horror. They whispered that Sporus looked just like Poppaea, the wife Nero had once adored, and then, in a fit of rage, had killed with a kick to the stomach. She was pregnant. She died quickly. And ever since, he had been haunted not by her screams, but by the silence that followed. Her absence rotted inside him. And when mourning didn't ease the ache, he did what emperors do. He replaced the irreplaceable. What is a soul to a man who owns the world? Sporus was barely past boyhood when he was chosen. His fate sealed not by his crimes, but by his resemblance. The resemblance, that was the only requirement. That his body echoed the woman who once warmed the sheets of the most dangerous man in Rome. They took him, held him, cut him, and when he awoke, the gods did not answer. Only Nero did, weeping with joy at the second coming of his beloved. She lives, he said. She lives again. The words wrapped around Sporus like rope, like a noose, like a curse. They gave him a ring, a title, a palace, but they took his voice, his manhood, his right to vanish. He wore royal silks with blood beneath them. He was paraded like a goddess reborn. He walked beside Nero not as consort, but as confession. Every step a reminder of what had been lost, and what Rome had allowed to be recreated. A golden mask made of skin. The people watched. Some gasped, others laughed, but no one intervened. Because power, when soaked in ritual, can justify anything. Even turning a boy into a bride, even calling it holy. And so we begin not with war, nor policy, nor greatness, but with a wedding soaked in grief and illusion. A wedding where love was measured by the pain it inflicted, where a ghost was resurrected, not through prayer, but through flesh. They crowned him queen, but all he ever was a wound. Now, the question festers. Can grief, when sharpened by empire, become cruelty? This is not just Nero's story. This is the anatomy of obsession, the theater of mourning. Because when the gods do not return, what power demands? Power demands. Power does not wait. It builds a new god, even if it must destroy a soul to do it. Before the blades, before the burning, before the madness, there was love. But what happens when love forgets how to be kind? Let's begin. Before the smoke curled around his crown, before his name became ash in every tongue, there was a boy. A boy with soft hands and frightened eyes, thrust into the furnace of empire. Nero did not seize power, was placed upon him like a wreath of thorns gifted by blood, arranged by mother, and sharpened by fear. Rome did not yet tremble when he walked. It sighed in hope, for Nero was beautiful, golden-haired, honey-voiced, with a touch of poetry in his speech and music in his fingers. A prince who preferred verse over violence. A ruler who played the lyre instead of drawing a blade. They said he might heal the empire, and in the beginning, tried. He banned executions, lowered taxes, freed slaves. The Senate adored him. The people wept with joy. The empire, weary from centuries of iron rule, leaned into his mercy like a mother into rest. And behind him stood Agrippina, his maker, his shadow, It was she who cleared his path with poison and seduction. She who sculpted him from the bones of rivals. She who whispered, "You will be emperor." While Rome still believed it had a choice, but no son remains a boy forever. The palace grew colder with every step he took toward autonomy. He began to push back, to look beyond her, to taste power on his own tongue and savor its sweetness. And Agrippina, who had once murdered for his throne, began to feel something sharper than betrayal, irrelevance. She stood behind a curtain of silk and saw her son speaking without her voice in his mouth, loving women she had not chosen, listening to advisors she had not trained. The boy was blooming. She was being buried beneath the petals. What happens when the architect of power becomes its prisoner? He tried to silence her gently, exile distance. But mothers do not die quietly, especially ones who build emperors. She returned, spoke in court, gathered allies. And so, the boy made a decision that would unravel everything. He ordered her death, not cleanly, not quickly. He tried first with a collapsing ship, then with a dagger, eventually a sword. She bled out in the name of Rome. That was the first fire. It lit not in the streets, but in the soul. A torch passed from the mother to the son of flame, soaked in fear and guilt. And yet, Rome still loved him. He performed in theaters, danced in gardens, declared games and feasts. He was not a tyrant, they said. He was just dramatic. And so, the empire lulled itself into a dream, because dreaming is easier than watching. And watching meant seeing what Nero was becoming. The boy was vanishing in his place, a mask with a crown, and behind that mask, something darker stirred. Grief, paranoia, rage, dressed in velvet. He began to kill, not for strategy, but for silence. Friends, advisors, lovers, and still he sang. The empire leaned closer. Hand missed the moment the golden boy set fire to the world, because when you teach a child, he is divine. You forget to show him how to be human, and that Rome would come to regret. She was the only thing he truly wanted. Not Rome, not glory, not the applause that echoed in marble theaters. Poppaea, a woman of impossible beauty and unbearable ambition. She glowed like a god's favorite statue, soft skin, sharper wit, and a gaze that bent emperors. Nero had power, yes, but she made him feel powerful. She praised his voice when others winced. She called his poetry divine, even as the Senate squirmed. And when she laughed, Nero forgot the blood on his hands, forgot his mother's scream. He forgot the crown that bruised his head every time he slept. She became his mirror, his muse, his mercy. But mercy is short-lived in palaces built on paranoia. At first, she was his queen in everything but name, then in title, then in spirit. And as her belly swelled with child, Nero dreamed of eternity, a dynasty, redemption, perhaps even love, not the kind fed to poets, but the kind that makes tyrants wish for gentleness. He promised her the world. And for a moment, it looked like he might keep it, but empires don't sleep, and rumors never die. They whispered that she ruled him, that she pulled his strings like Agrippina once did, that she mocked him in private, that the child was not his, that her beauty had become a weapon too sharp for any man to hold. And Nero, who had once killed his mother to be free, began to see the same trap in Poppaea's smile. Was it love or the beginning of another cage? One night, drunk on suspicion and the rot of too much power, Nero lost his temper. No blade, no poison, just his fists and the fury of a god who had been mocked. He struck her belly. Once, twice, she screamed. The child died first, begged her, and just like that, the only softness in his world turned to silence. They said he mourned, that he wouldn't eat. that he cradled her corpse and wept into her hair, that he ordered perfumes poured over her body until the entire palace stank of roses and rot, that he demanded her embalmed in gold, her image cast in marble, her name carved into stars. But no shrine can undo a death born of your own hands. Poppaea's absence became a hunger, a need, an ache so deep it twisted his mind into a spiral of obsession. And that is when he found Sporus, a boy, barely grown, with wide eyes and the same softness in his cheekbones that once belonged to her. Nero did not court him, consumed him. He had him castrated, cut, reshaped, remade. Not into a man, not into a slave, but into a replica, a resurrection, a living tomb. He dressed the boy in Poppaea's gowns, called him empress, married him in a public ceremony, rings, veils. The people laughed at first, then they whispered, then they feared. What kind of love digs up the grave and demands the corpse still smile? What kind of grief demands a body be erased, only to be reborn in the flesh of another? Nero didn't know anymore. He only knew that Sporus, now Poppaea, reborn, must never cry, must never age, must never speak the truth of who he was, because if the illusion broke, Nero would too. And so began a reign not of iron, but of hallucination, where masks became people, where love became performance, where guilt were silk and called itself devotion. And in this madness, Rome began to crack not from war or rebellion, but from the sound of one man's grief echoing through marble halls, a grief so loud it drowned out the screams that would soon rise from fire. It started with a flicker, a distant glow curling into the night like a whisper of anger too long held in. Then the wind carried it, roof to roof, wall to wall, till the heavens themselves blushed red. Rome burned not like a city caught by accident, but like a sacrifice, like a god had finally opened his mouth and exhaled wrath. The flames rose with intention, devouring temples, homes, bodies, and prayers in the same breath. Mothers screamed for their children. Priests collapsed before altars, now crowned in ash. Bones cracked beneath collapsing stone. And Nero, he sang dot, while 10 districts crumbled. He stood on a private stage, strumming his lyre. Dressed in a costume of Greek tragedy. Some say he wept for Troy as he sang. Others say he laughed. But I'll agree on this. Nero did not run. He did not fight. The fire he performed. What kind of emperor meets the apocalypse with applause? The people begged for answers, for water, for leadership. Instead, they got poetry. Declarations that it was fate, that the fire would cleanse corruption, that a new, divine Rome would rise from this holy ash. But in the rubble, they saw the truth. Nero had not saved them. He had stood above them, watching, perhaps even ordering it. Whispers of arson clung to his name like soot. Whispers that the fire had been planned, that slaves had lit torches on command, that the emperor wanted space to build a new golden palace, a city made in his image, one where no memory of the old Rome remained. So he blamed the Christians, an obscure, misunderstood cult, followers of a crucified Jew, peaceful, secretive, different, perfect scapegoats. He called them arsonists, traitors, blasphemers, and the punishment. Cruelty dressed as spectacle. They were nailed to crosses, wrapped in animal skins, and torn apart by dogs, set aflame and used as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. The emperor would stroll beneath their burning bodies as if walking through stars, nodding as if admiring his own constellations. Wine flowed, music played, children clapped. Horror became entertainment. The monster did not just dance, he made the world dance with him. What does it mean when the ruler becomes the executioner, the playwright, and the audience all at once? When grief is no longer grief, but theater. Rome, once the crown of civilization, became a stage for one man's unraveling. Senators feared to speak. Artists fled. Philosophers drank poison rather than live in parody. 2. Because in this empire, truth no longer lived in scrolls or courts, it lived in Nero's delusions, and yet some still cheered, because fear is louder than facts, and madness, when dressed in gold, can resemble divinity. So Rome burned, and the emperor sang, not just for himself, but for a vision that only he could see, a world purged of memory, it by flame, ruled by a man who had killed his past and renamed it love. But fire doesn't choose what it consumes, and soon it would turn on its maker. The palace rose like a hallucination, a monument not to Rome, but to Nero's ego. Walls inlaid with mother of pearl, ceilings that rained perfume, dining halls that rotated with the stars, and at its heart, a colossal statue of the emperor himself, taller than any god. It was called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, but it wasn't built with stone and mortar alone. It was built with silence, with screams, with blood that ran unseen beneath its polished floors. Every brick echoed the cost, land seized from nobles, fortune drained from Rome's treasury, ashes of the homes that had burned, crushed, and swept aside to clear space for Nero's dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was a mirror, a reflection of a soul that no longer resembled a man by now. His mind was unraveling. The line between performance and power had vanished. He didn't rule, he played roles. One day, he was a tragic lover, weeping for his lost wife. The next, a charioteer demanding applause. The next, a god. And gods need no family. One by one, the people closest to him vanished. His stepbrother, Britannicus, poisoned at a banquet. His first wife, executed for political convenience. His second wife, kicked to death while pregnant in a fit of rage. And then came the boy, Sporus, a salt-faced slave, barely more than a child, said to resemble Nero's dead wife so perfectly that the emperor could not bear to lose him. So he had him castrated. Kent dressed him in royal silks, paraded him as a bride, called him Empress, married him in a mock ceremony under torchlight, watched in silence, not out of acceptance, but out of paralysis. It's because how do you resist a god who can rewrite grief into ritual? It's what is left of a boy when his name, his voice, his very body is taken? What is left of a kingdom when such horror no longer causes outrage, but awe? Nero had crossed the final threshold. He no longer needed loyalty, he needed worship. Statues bearing his image flooded the empire, coins stamped with his face, songs praising his beauty, his genius, his mercy. But mercy had long since drowned beneath the golden ceilings of the palace, and those ceilings began to crack. Famine spread, rebellions sparked, senators whispered treason behind closed doors, generals turned away. The people who once feared him now feared something worse, that their suffering was meaningless, that they were not even pawns in his game. It's background noise to a spectacle. The palace glittered, but its foundations rotted. Nero, draped in silks and illusions, stood on the balcony of his empire, believing himself immortal, while the city, the army, and the world slowly turned their backs. But flesh is not gold, and madness, no matter how beautifully dressed, always begins to smell. So the boy stood beside the emperor, a living monument to all that had been broken, in Rome, beneath its gilded rot, began to hunger for a different ending. In the end, it was not a blade that first betrayed Nero. It was silence. It's a kind of silence that seeps in after the applause has died and the crowd has gone home. the kind that doesn't echo but absorbs. He had performed too long, too loud, too mad, and now Rome was bored. The generals stopped writing. The governors stopped answering. The Senate, once his chorus of praise, sat in cold detachment. They no longer feared him. They pitied him. The man who once claimed the stars were his stage now couldn't command a single soldier. His words, once law, became laughter behind closed doors. And yet Nero did not understand. He wandered his palace in costume, practicing lines from tragedies as if they were state decrees. He sang to an audience that no longer listened. The boy, Sporus' empress, still followed, still dressed in the stolen identity of the dead. But even his eyes now flickered with something else. Not love, not loyalty. Something quieter, something more dangerous. Perhaps it was awareness. Perhaps it was sorrow. But Nero did not see it. He saw only ghosts, his mother's eyes in every mirror, his dead wife's face behind every curtain, his whispers crawling through the marble halls, like insects under the skin. Rome had begun to rot in revolt. In Gaul, rebellion. In Hispania, defection. The Praetorian Guard, his last shield, slipped away. Still, he called for performances. "Bring the lyre," he said. "Let them hear me sing while the world ends." They did not come. The city moved without him. A Senate decree was passed. Nero, once emperor, was now a public enemy. No trial, no last words, no grand confrontation. Just erasure. History, it seemed, would not even give him the dignity of a villain's death. He had become an embarrassment. And so, in a borrowed villa on the outskirts of Rome, Nero hid. Not as a god, not as a ruler, but as a fugitive in rags. The man who had called himself divine now begged for help from freedmen and servants. He wandered gardens, mumbling, "What an artist dies in me." It's as if art could shield him from consequence. But the footsteps came anyway. They did not rush. They did not thunder. He crept soft, certain, final. When he heard that the soldiers were near, Nero looked to his last loyal servant and asked him to dig a grave. Not to hide in, but to die near. Then, trembling, he pressed a dagger to his throat and hesitated. "Is this what it feels like?" He whispered, "To die unloved." And then he drove it in, but not deeply enough. The hand that had written laws, strummed lyres, signed executions, shook. It failed. It could not even finish its final act. So his servant, weeping, helped push the blade deeper. And just like that, the god bled like a man. What do we call a death no one mourns? He was 30 years old. The world did not pause. No temples fell. No stars dimmed. Rome sighed and kept moving. His name was erased from monuments. Its image shattered. His legacy sealed not in marble, but in memory's disdain. And yet, in the cracked silence of that final room, with the golden threads of his robe soaked in blood, Nero may have understood, quote, that power without love is a performance, quote, and all performances end, even for emperors. They did not carry his body through the streets. There were no hymns, no processions, no coins struck in his honor. The emperor of Rome, once called divine, was buried like a criminal in a shallow grave on the estate of a freedman. His corpse, still wrapped in royal purple, was lowered into the earth with no ceremony, no priest, and no empire to witness it. The man who had called himself Apollo, who believed himself eternal, vanished like ash in the wind, and the city exhaled. For the first time in years, Rome breathed without trembling. The statues came down. His name was stricken from public records. The Senate, once his stage, declared him damned in memory damnatio memorianda, the final curse of Roman pride. Caesar did not merely die. He was officially unmade, like a stain, scrubbed from a palace floor. But the stain lingered. The empire he left behind was not healed, was hollow. A treasury, once bled dry for his spectacles, stood empty. The provinces boiled in rebellion. The people who once begged for bread in circuses now faced famine in silence, and the throne he left behind became a wound no one could seal. In the year that followed, 4 emperors rose and fell in chaos. Rome devoured them all. The gods left the stage, and only blood remained. Still, in alleyways and taverns, his name was whispered. Some remembered the laughter, the games, the music, drifting through moonlit gardens, and they wondered, was he truly the monster they had been told? Some did not wonder. They remembered the screams, the fire, the boy in the bridal veil, the mother with a blade in her womb, the city choking on smoke while he sang. And they said he deserved no tomb. But history is not clean. In the decades that followed, strange things happened. In the eastern provinces, rumors spread Nero was not dead. He had escaped, disguised, waiting. Some called him a savior, others an omen. False Neros appeared, claiming to be the emperor returned. They gathered followers. They incited fear, because Rome, even in its power, was afraid of what it had made. A man so cruel, they feared his resurrection more than his reign. And beneath that fear was something darker, the realization that Nero had not created the madness. He had only performed it louder than the rest. Rome itself had always been built on spectacle and sacrifice. Nero simply removed the mask, and once unmasked, it could never forget. The man was gone, but the rot remained. His death did not end the horror, it exposed it. And so he became something worse than a tyrant. He became a mirror. He died alone, but he never truly left. Nero's body dissolved into dirt, but his shadow stretched across centuries longer, darker, and more alive than he ever was. In death, he became what he never managed in life, unforgettable, because history could not bury him. Every tyrant who came after wore pieces of his face. Every mad ruler, every blood-soaked crown, every whisper of a leader who thought himself divine, his name was there, not as a warning, but as a blueprint. The burning cities, the wives turned to corpses, the blurred line between theater and cruelty. Nero had done it all first. What is the cost of making cruelty into culture? Rome wanted to forget, and so it remembered obsessively. Coins were melted, statues were shattered, paintings scratched clean. But forgetting requires silence, and Nero was too loud to silence. His name became a story, and the story became a myth, and the myth became a ghost that haunted emperors in their sleep. Some claimed he was not a monster, but a scapegoat, that his crimes were exaggerated by those who came after, that the fires, the murders, the boy in the veil were fabrications. But even in that, he triumphed, because the doubt only made him stronger. Is there any villain more powerful than thee? One we cannot quite prove. Beth Christians, once his victims, later turned him into the Antichrist in apocalyptic texts, a beast who would rise again in the final days. Pagan cults in the East lit candles in his name, praying for his return. Poets wrote verses about his voice, his beauty, his madness, confused admiration, wrapped in horror, and in every tale, the lines blurred further. Was he a tragic artist, undone by a cruel world, or was he a butcher who painted his crimes in music? Was he lonely, or was he hollow? No one could answer. And that was his final victory. In the ruins of his palace, the marble still glows red at sunset, as if stained by memory. Tourists walk the halls now, snapping photos where blood once dried. They say his spirit lingers, that in the right silence you can hear music echo through the stones. A lyre, a whisper, a scream, but it's not his ghost that haunts Rome. It's the question he left behind. If a man like Nero can rule, what does that say about those who let him? Because tyrants do not rise alone. Fed, applauded. Nero was not an accident. He was an answer to the hunger of an empire that wanted spectacle more than justice, and that is the legacy he left us. A city that mistook madness for majesty, a world that could not look away. A boy turned God, turned ghost, and in the silence that followed his scream, Rome heard something worse than music. It heard its own reflection. He had the eyes of a child, the silence of a servant, and the fate of an empress. Sporus was not chosen. A T was sculpted cut, renamed, dressed in silk that still smelled of blood. They say, Nero looked at him and saw Poppaea. Not her spirit, not her soul, her body, her face, her outline. That was all he wanted, a ghost with skin. He did not mourn his wife. He resurrected her, but not in spirit, in flesh. What kind of love kills, then carves a replacement? Sporus was castrated, publicly, a clean cut to ensure the illusion would never be broken. He was not a man, not a woman. He became a symbol, a mirror Nero forced the world to look into. At court ceremonies, he wore Poppaea's jewels. He walked behind Nero as a queen would. He dined beside him. He kissed him, dressed in bridal white, and the court bowed. They bowed, Rome watched, and did not scream, 'cause it was not a kingdom anymore, was a stage, and the emperor was not leading. He was performing, with a boy dressed as his dead wife, as the centerpiece of his theater of power. Was it madness? Or was it mourning weaponized? Sporus never spoke of it. There are no words from his lips recorded in history, just whispers, just silence. Maybe he loved Nero. Maybe he feared him. Maybe he knew that resistance would only bring the same fate. Poppaea met one kick, one scream, one death disguised as rage. So he played the part, until the actor became the costume. But this was not love. It was control, dressed in ceremony. Tease was grief mutilated into madness, and Sporus, still bleeding, still young, was not a consort. He was an altar upon which Nero offered his guilt. Years later, after Nero's death, Sporus tried to live, but the world would not let him forget the part he had been forced to play. Other emperors saw him not as a man, but as a novelty. One made him perform in public mock weddings, Another handed him 2 soldiers who laughed as they called him empress, In the end, the silence returned. He took his own life, quietly, without spectacle. No veil, no ceremony, no crown. Leave the silence that had always lived behind his eyes. How many lives are erased, not by knives, but by names? Nero had tried to fill the hole in his soul with a body. But bodies do not replace souls, and ghosts cannot be married. Only mourned. Sporus was the final chapter in a story that was never about love. It was about a man who believed power could reanimate the dead, and a boy who became the price of that illusion. Before the flames, there was music. Nero strummed his lyre while the wind carried smoke through the marble arches of his palace. They say he wore a robe of stars and sang of Troy's ruin as Rome cracked open beneath him. But this was no ancient myth. This was real ash thick enough to choke a newborn, fire licking the feet of statues, and stone splitting from heat. No prayer could cool. The city burned. Not a quarter, not a district. 3/4 of Rome vanished in a sea of flame. And still Nero played. What kind of ruler watches his kingdom die to compose a song? He blamed the Christians, called them arsonists, called them devils, called them guilty because someone had to be. They were rounded up, dragged through streets, and nailed to 2 crosses. Some were burned alive at night to light Nero's gardens, living torches in a feast of agony. The empire didn't burn once, it burned twice, first in fire, then in conscience. And Nero watched it all, not as a protector, but as a playwright. He rebuilt the city in his name, wider streets, taller arches, all spiraling toward the Domus Aurea, his golden palace. A house so vast it devoured the land where citizens once prayed and slept and loved. He stood atop it, not grateful for survival, but proud of spectacle. Was this destruction or transformation masquerading as art? To Nero, Rome was not a home. It was a canvas. The blood, the rubble, the bone, all were brushstrokes in a portrait of power. He was not content with ruling the empire. He wanted to remake it in his image, and to do that, the old Rome had to die. But beneath the gold leaf in grand halls, something was rotting. Senators whispered of madness. Generals questioned their orders. The people mourned in shadows, not just for their homes, but for their identity. What is a city if its soul is stripped away brick by brick? Nero didn't care. He composed, he sculpted, he acted, as if the screams outside his windows were mere ambience for his performance. He was emperor by law, but artist by obsession. And Rome, to him, was a stage worth burning. Can a man love beauty so much he destroys the world to create it? This was not negligence. It was vision unbound by mercy. And when the ashes settled, only one truth remained. Nero did not light the match because he hated Rome. He lit it because he loved the sound of flames more than the cries of his people. And the empire never forgave him. Power never shouts when it vanishes. It slips away, quiet, patient, disguised as applause. Nero believed he was adored, even as the ground beneath him cracked with discontent, even as the Senate rehearsed betrayal in polished marble halls, even as generals sharpened their silence. What happens when a god wakes up mortal? His empire was bleeding, not from barbarians, but from within. The provinces groaned under taxes. The legions whispered of revolt. Allies vanished one, by blade, by exile, or by fear. And in the shadows, the name Galba spread, like infection. A governor, once loyal, now bold enough to take Rome itself. But Nero didn't believe it. He still performed, still dressed in costume, still rehearsed tragedies where the emperor dies, hoping the gods might see it as a trade. But the gods were tired, and Rome had stopped clapping. Then came the final betrayal. The Senate, his own Senate, declared him a public enemy, not just unfit to rule, but unfit to live. How does a man face a mirror that finally reflects what others see? He ran, not to fight, not to bargain, but to disappear, in disguise, like a thief fleeing the house he once built. With a single companion left, a freedman, not a general, he wandered outside Rome, into the wilds, into the dirt. There was no palace now, only silence, only the sound of soldiers hunting. He asked for someone to kill him. No one moved in. The end, he did it himself, barely. With trembling hands, he pressed a dagger to his throat, and when it pierced the skin, the freedman pushed it deeper. His final words, cracked and bleeding. What an artist dies in me. No final roar, no noble stand. Just a man in a ditch, clutching the last piece of his illusion. Nero did not die like a tyrant. He died like a child who thought the world was a play and could not bear the curtain falling. Is it justice? And the punishment is silence. The monster had fallen, but the horror was not that he died. The horror was that Rome once followed him, and the world never forgot. Nero is dead, but he never really left. His name was erased from monuments, his statues pulled down, his legacy rewritten. But the stain remained, kin the marble cracks of Rome, in the silence of burned temples, in the eyes of every ruler who ever feared the love of the people was a lie. They called it damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. But memory is not a stone you can crush. It is a wound. It pulses in secret. It waits. How do you bury a ghost that still sings? Years passed, then decades, and something strange began. Whispers in the streets, songs in the alleyways. The poor began to say he wasn't dead, that he had escaped, that he would return, not as a tyrant, as a savior. They called it the Nero Redivivus legend, okay? Belief that the monster would rise again, not to destroy, but to restore, to burn down the false order and replace it with beauty, with music, with justice. The very things he had poisoned. Can evil be so seductive it becomes holy in absence? The horror is not that Nero ruled. The horror is that he was missed, that a man who bathed in blood could still make the world dream. That pain, when wrapped in gold and melody, can become myth, okay? That somewhere deep in human longing, we would rather follow madness with a crown than silence with no story. Look at history. Look at now. How many Neros walk among us, smiling, charming, broken men who promise art and bring ash? How many crowds still clap for fire? How many thrones still wait for the one who dares everything? Is it madness to fear a ghost, or wisdom to listen when it whispers again? His tomb is lost, his body gone, but his echo remains in power, unchecked in beauty, weapead, in the slow decay of empires too. It's proud to kneel. He was not just a man, he was a warning, and we have not learned